Our gathering this evening is our response to the call of our Provincial Assembly and our Shalom reps to increase our knowledge and understanding of the immigration process as it is in our country now. We do this with the intention of raising our collective voice as School Sisters of Notre Dame in a corporate stance on comprehensive immigration reform. Ron Clutho and Sister Paulette Weindell, who is Precious Blood from O'Fallon, are going to share with us tonight their knowledge, expertise, and years of experience to give us some insights and move us forward in this process. I want to tell you first that it was 1995 when I was looking for a new ministry, and I saw the St. Louis newspaper with a picture of Ron Clutho and Sister Paulette Weindell and what they were doing at St. Pius Parish. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. Those of you who know St. Pius, it's kind of known, or it was known, as the Refugee Parish in the city of St. Louis. So the two of them were working together when I met them. Ron is going to give us a broad overview of how refugees get from their country into the United States. And I think it's a very important thing to understand terminology that he is going to use and define, because that's really the background that we need for our own study in preparation for our corporate stance. Paulette will share some of the problems refugees face once they are here, because she dealt with them for 20, 30 years. Paulette is also a member of her community's corporate stance task force, who are now taking steps to implement their corporate stance. So we are right smack getting some information that is being worked on in her community, and possibly we can learn or work on too for our own corporate stance. We'll start with Ron, and then we'll go into Paulette's part. So I am very, very happy to introduce first Ron Clutho. Ron?
And we're kind of a tag team, so I think Sister Paulette might come in and interrupt me now and then, and I'll do the same with her. We've been doing this together for a long time, so we kind of play off of each other. So,
Interrupt me a lot.
As Sister Elisa, I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of the immigrant and refugee process, but actually I'm going to focus more on refugees as opposed to immigrants, because that's what I know and that's who I work with. But the first thing I'm going to do is kind of briefly talk about these 4 different types of people. I'll give you a brief definition of each one, and then I'm going to focus in on refugees for most of my talk. So an immigrant is somebody who's chosen to come to the United States, and somebody who has, had time to prepare to come mentally, financially, linguistically. Usually they come because of for school or a job or a marriage. It's somebody that is kind of ready to hit the ground running. They don't receive any assistance from the government. They are expected to be able to be self-sufficient when they come, or their spouse or their employer is willing to vouch for them that they won't be a drain on society. And usually there's a long wait for people to come here as a legal immigrant. Okay, that's the first category. Second category is I'm going to talk about as an asylee. And these are people that have had to flee their country but have not yet been given refugee status when they arrive here, as opposed to refugees who have been given that status, which I'll talk about in a minute. Generally, an asylee meaning somebody who's seeking asylum, would come here either legally or illegally, and then they would have to usually get a lawyer, which is expensive, and prove that if they go back to their country, their life would be in danger. It's very difficult to prove this because many times they would have fled with not a lot of documentation, and they have to come up with documentation or proof that it would be difficult for them to go back. I can give you an example of somebody that my agency has been working with lately. He's from Afghanistan. His brother is studying. He came here on a student visa, and so our client came here ostensibly to visit his brother on a tourist visa, but he wants to stay, and the reason why is because I mentioned he's from Afghanistan. You know, Afghanistan is technically a democracy, I guess, but the Taliban still controls large areas of the country. And our friend is an entertainer. He's an actor and a singer, and his lifestyle is considered sinful by the Taliban, so he's been persecuted quite a bit for what he does. And so he's been, you know, we're trying to gather proof that because of what his profession is, it would be dangerous for him to go back. It's interesting. I went with him one time to the International Institute, which you may know is the resettlement agency. I went with him there to enroll him in English classes, and when we were waiting in the waiting area, I felt like I was with Brad Pitt because every Afghani person that came in recognized him from music videos. I'd never heard of him, but the Afghani community here was really familiar with him. So we're hoping that it'll work out for him. The next category is undocumented immigrant, and to tell you the truth, I don't really have that much experience with this population, although I know they exist in St. Louis. Usually they arrive in the country illegally, and as refugees have to prove that they can't go back because of danger. If it's just fleeing poverty or economic reasons, that's not considered grounds for refugee status. So a lot of the people that are here as undocumented are fleeing poverty. There have been some cases of people coming lately from Central America where there's a lot of gang and drug violence who have been able to prove that they would be in danger if they went back. But for the most part, people that are coming over from the southern border are considered not political refugees. So it's a little bit more difficult for them. And since they're kind of under the radar, they don't have a lot of options, so they often are exploited by employers or by people that give them work for maybe minimum wage or actually less than minimum wage, and usually bad working conditions. And they don't qualify for any kind of assistance. They don't qualify for Social Security cards or green cards. They're really like ghost people. Now, I'm going to sort of narrow in on refugees and spend most of my time talking about refugees because that's what Sister Paulette and I have been working with for 25 years. Now, these are people that have also been forced to flee their country due to war, genocide, or persecution, but not economic reasons, although many of them are also poor. But the fact that they're fleeing persecution because of their religion or ethnicity or political belief gives them refugee status. They have not chosen to leave their country, but they've been forced out. And they generally come after a long wait in a refugee camp in a third country, which I'll explain in a few minutes. Often they don't come with English. They usually don't come with resources. And they receive limited assistance from the government once they come here. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, this is the United Nations definition of a refugee: people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and who cannot or do not want to return. And you have to prove that before you come to this country. The refugees, you have to, as opposed to asylum seekers who are already here, they have to prove that they can't go back. People that have come here as refugees have already done that. They've already proven to our State Department people overseas that they can't go back. So they're here as refugees already. These are two, I didn't make these up, but I think these are two really good ways to look at the difference between immigrants and refugees. Immigrants are pulled out for a promise of a better, well, maybe by a spouse or a job, where refugees are pushed out by whoever wants to get rid of them because of their religion or political belief. Immigrants walk out of their country where refugees have to run out. And I'm just going to throw some facts and figures to you. This is from 2015. There were 65.3 million people displaced around the world compared to 59.5 million just 12 months earlier. These are just people who have been forced to leave their home. They're not technical refugees yet. But the second bullet point says there are 21 million recognized refugees around the world who are in refugee camps waiting to be allowed to go to United States or Canada or Australia. Generally, these refugee camps are set up in neighboring countries from where the refugees are fleeing. For example, we have a lot of Somalis that lived in a couple of refugee camps in Kenya, which is a neighboring country. We have a lot of Bhutanese people who lived in Nepal in refugee camps for 20, 30 years, actually. A lot of the Bosnians that came here lived in Croatia before they arrived. And I'll talk more about the camps, but one thing to keep in mind is that these neighboring countries don't necessarily welcome these refugees. These camps are set up by the United Nations, and they're pretty bare bones. I've got some pictures to show you of some of them. But the local people really don't want them there, and sometimes they make it really difficult for them. Out of these 21 million people in the world now as refugees, only a tiny fraction actually are resettled elsewhere. The goal actually is that everybody will be able to go back home to their own country. But as you probably know, it doesn't happen very often. A lot of times, there is one case that I can think of that it was successful, and that was the case of Kosovo. In 1999, Kosovo used to be part of Yugoslavia, and there was some ethnic conflict there similar to Bosnia. We got a wave of refugees from Kosovo in 1999 in St. Louis. And about 5 years later, Kosovo gained independence from Serbia. And I'm sure it's difficult, but it's sort of peaceful now. And at least half of the Kosovo refugees that were in St. Louis have returned to Kosovo. And so that's a good thing. But for the most part, people are forced to leave for good, and they have a dream of going back home sometimes because they remember the good days. These are people that, for most of their lives, things were good, but there was a new political regime or something that happened in the country that caused conflict, and so people were forced to leave. But they have a lot of good memories from their countries, too. Feel free to interrupt anytime. Some more statistics. These are on the upper right part of this slide, the green part. I don't know if you can read the captions, but the three countries now where we have the most, the 54% of the total amount of refugees in the world come from these three countries: Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. And the bottom table shows you where the top hosting countries. I talked about the neighboring countries where refugee camps are set up. That's what this is. You can see that on the right, Turkey now, or at least in 2015, was hosting temporarily the largest number of refugees, mostly from Syria and Iraq. Pakistan is the next one, and a lot of them would have been from Afghanistan. And Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, and Jordan. These countries are not exactly wealthy countries either, but that's where the refugees have turned up, and that's what the UN does what they can to help them while they're there. Everybody knows about Syria now. There are 4.5 million refugees, Syrians are refugees, 4.8 are refugees worldwide. A lot of them are children. We have it's probably about 10 or 12,000 refugees in the U.S. right now from Syria. In St. Louis, we've got, I would estimate, 75 families that have come from Syrian families that have come to St. Louis over the last several years. My agency is not a resettlement agency. The International Institute is, so we kind of work with people after they've already arrived. But the International Institute tells us that the few refugees that are coming in now are ones that were already in process in the pipeline, but apparently that's going to end in the end of the summer, at least temporarily, until this travel ban ends. But the Syrians would have been probably the largest group coming in. Right now, the largest group coming in is Congolese people. I'll talk more about those different groups in a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to talk now about how people are designated to be refugees. How does the process start? Who is a refugee? How do they become a refugee? I mentioned they've been ethnically cleansed, or I hate this expression, but that's what was coined during the Bosnian conflict. People have been forced to flee to a neighboring country. Then, as I said, the UN sets up these temporary camps. It's very primitive. It's not like a, Club Med. It's no running water, very basic foods. They will get, it's not like a nice cafeteria or restaurant or kitchen, but it is people handing out 5-pound sacks of rice to a family for 2 weeks, and it's up to them to go out and find water and firewood to cook it. They are just subsistence. They have limited medical care, if any. Threat of bandits or enemies from outside. I talked about the local population doesn't really want them there, so a lot of times there are sexual assaults. And there's also I didn't write this down, but there's also a problem with wild animals in some of these countries, like Kenya, who are nearby and can get into the camp and attack people. Very crowded. It's often very dangerous. And a lot of times there are bad people that have kind of gotten control, and they kind of control what goes on in these camps. Here's some pictures of what people lived like before they came here. The upper one is a picture in Thailand that Burmese people lived in, and the lower one is one of the camps in Croatia that housed Bosnians in the 90s. And sometimes these were formerly abandoned military shelters, but a lot of times it was just tents like this that were just set up in this Croatian picture. These are the two camps in Kenya that we have a lot of people in St. Louis from. The Dadaab one and the lower one, that's the largest refugee camp in the world. 56,000 people live there, and then Kakuma camp in the upper right or upper left we have hundreds of people in St. Louis that lived in that Kakuma camp before they came here. That's how many years they live in the camp. Bosnians lived there for 3 to 5 years. We were meeting people from Bhutan who lived in refugee camps for 24, 25 years. I know people from Burundian people I know one man that we were helping to study for the citizenship test for. He's 41 years old. He was born in a refugee camp in Tanzania and lived there until he came here when he was like 36. So he never went to school. And he was trying to study for the citizenship test, illiterate in his own language, let alone English. So there are some makeshift attempts at education, which I'll mention in a minute, but it's terrible. These are some pictures of refugee camps where Syrians are living in Turkey and in Lebanon. A lot of times, people who happen to have been teachers in their country before they were driven out just volunteer to teach kids in the camp to keep them busy, to prepare them for when they eventually, hopefully, get out. I found some pictures of sort of makeshift camps in the schools. This is a picture of a camp in Yemen with Somali kids. Afghanis in Pakistan. And, you know, they might have one textbook that they all share. They might have one blackboard that somebody might donate. But they do what they can. They really want the kids to be prepared for when they eventually come here or somewhere. I hate this picture, but I love this picture because it really gives the idea of what it's like, how dehumanizing it is to live in a refugee camp. I mentioned they don't get served in a cafeteria. They have to, you know, fight for rations like this, and then they have to go out and find a way to cook the food. It's usually rice and beans and, you know, macaroni, things like that. It's nothing. I don't think they get fresh fruit or anything like that. And they have to collect water and firewood, and you know, it's usually not very clean, but this is what they deal with. And this is why we are so impressed. I mean, I don't think I could survive this. And I often ask refugees how they survive it, and they say, you do because you have to. Sister Elise mentioned an event we had at the History Museum last month. We asked for refugees to share their stories about how we called it strength and resilience. How did you survive this? And they shared their stories, and I feel like I learned whatever minimal thing I've helped people with, I've gotten hundreds of times back from just learning about the human spirit and what is important and what's not important. So, anyway. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some more statistics. This is a little bit old. I think it says 2014. I don't know why Germany's not on this list, but the column on the far right shows the ratio of refugees to the host population. So Australia actually, how do I say this? As a percentage of the total population, they take the most, I guess the most per capita, I should say. Australia's number 1. United States is number 3 on there. We took 73,000 refugees in 2014. It's down to 50,000 now. We were taking 120,000 a year up until 9/11, and then it went way down to like 40,000 because we were much more careful about screening and vetting people before we allowed them to come. And it's been ticking back up, and now it's kind of going down again. This is the top 10 countries that we were getting refugees from in the United States last year. The largest one was the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Syria was number 2. Burma's number 3. I noticed number 9 is Ukraine, which surprised me. I don't think we're getting anybody from Ukraine, at least until now in St. Louis. I'm assuming that is due to the conflict with Russia over the last couple years. But the first 3 kind of mirror what we're getting in St. Louis. Congo, Syria, and Burma are probably the top 3 we're getting in St. Louis too, at least last year. And then this shows you the 3 years prior to that, 2015, 14, and 13. 2015 is on the left. I don't know if you can see that, but Burma is number 1 and Iraq is number 2 in 2015. And then the 2 years previous to that, it was Iraq and Burma, but just switched up. Iraq was number 1 and Burma's number 2. And then, you know, Somalia, Syria, Eritrea, Ethiopia. I'm not going to go through all this now, but this is basically what happens, the screening process. I mentioned that the people are living in refugee camps in third countries. We send State Department people to these refugee camps, as you know, Australia does, Canada does, other countries do too, and we interview people very carefully to make sure that they are A, truly refugees and can't go back, and B, are not terrorists or up to no good. So there's a lot of stuff they look at, like you know, level of education, occupational skills, ethnic origins. They want to know all that stuff, but they also want to know about. They take fingerprints. They check databases for terrorist organizations. It's quite stringent. So, you know, I don't think, I'm not the first person that said this, but if anybody really wants to commit terrorism in this country, this is not the way to do it, because people that come as refugees are vetted very well before they come here. Okay, maybe I should stop there. Any questions so far? That's kind of the end of overseas. I'm going to start talking about what happens when they come here now. unless there are any questions. Okay. So United States has about probably 50 or 60 refugee resettlement agencies around the country, including the International Institute in St. Louis. And every month they agree to take a certain number of refugees. If we get 50,000 over the course of a year, then let's say we get, I don't know, so many hundred or so many thousand per month. The International Institute in St. Louis agrees to take, say, 200 this month or 300 this month, based on available housing, whether or not they have anchor relatives here, available jobs, and so on. And as you can see, Texas, this is a pie chart of what states take the most refugees. Texas is number 1, California is number 2. Missouri is not on this list of the top 10, but I think we've been growing a lot in the last 20 years. Since the 90s, we've become more of a destination for refugees. Although the refugees themselves don't have a choice of where they go. They just go wherever, whatever city will take them. And then this is what the refugee resettlement agencies provide. They fly them in, but they have to pay that ticket back after 6 months or whenever they start working, just like a student loan. A lot of Americans have a misunderstanding, including a lot of my relatives, have a misunderstanding about what refugees get or don't get. I want to clear up some of these myths tonight. So yeah, they have to pay back the price of this ticket. Their utilities and apartment is paid for 2 or 3 months. They get minimal, basic, used furniture and dishes. Usually each family will get, when they arrive, they'll be met at the airport by a caseworker from the resettlement agency who will take them to their apartment. For some reason, it usually happens in the middle of the night. I don't know why. And they're exhausted when they come home, and there's usually in the apartment, it's like one mattress on the floor for each. And I'm not knocking the International Institute. I'm not criticizing them. That's just the way it is because of limited budgets. But they've got one mattress on the floor for each member of the family. That's the one thing that is required to be a new piece of furniture. But then most of the other furniture is gently used. So there's usually a couch, a coffee table, one plate, one fork, one knife, one spoon, for each member of the family, one plate, one fork, one knife, one spoon. A couple of pots and pans, really limited. They've got in their refrigerator, they'll have a chicken. What else? Maybe a bunch of bananas, a bag of rice, enough to get through the weekend. And then the caseworker will come back on Monday or the next day and start them in the process of getting Americanized, which would be taking them to enroll in English classes, helping them get their Social Security cards, finding a job. They're expected to become self-sufficient really fast because since the International Institute and other agencies are always receiving new families, not so much now, but there's always pressure to move people along so we can, get the new arrivals settled. So there's a lot of pressure. You want to say something? There's a lot of pressure to learn English and get a job. And as I said, unfortunately, a lot of the people don't speak English when they come here because they never thought they would have to come here. They never studied English back home. Some of them do, but many of them don't. Also, many of them are traumatized by the things they've witnessed and survived, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So and they're often placed in dangerous neighborhoods here where they hear gunfire at night. They think they're kind of going to be able to relax and let their guard down, but it's sometimes. I've had refugees tell me that they felt safer in a refugee camp than they felt in the neighborhoods where they were living in St. Louis. You've probably heard that too. Yeah, but they actually hear gunshots too. This is from the International Institute's website, and this is what they provide per person. This is what they're mandated to. So again, I'm not blaming anybody. This is just what the budget allows per person. And when I'll let you look at this when you look at this yourself when I email you the information. But it's just basically it's very limited assistance. And then this is more statistics the agencies, the International Institute usually has to find donations from agencies. They do a lot of fundraising events to get more money to expand the limited resources they get from the government. People get TANF and Medicaid. They get what they call refugee Medicaid, and they get it for 8 months. But sometimes it'll take 6 months to get a refugee card and another 6 months to get an appointment with the doctor, and by that time their time is up. They also are connected to the Division of Family Services to get food stamps, and once they start working, the food stamps are cut. They can reapply like anybody else could, but if their income is quote unquote too high, they won't qualify, and it's a really low threshold. But in the middle of this slide, it says 4 months after arrival, 67% are working, at least one member of the family is working, one adult, and after 6 months, 85% are working. So they want to work. They don't want to just lay around. They come here ready to work. And they come here, we've seen this so many times, people that, not everybody comes without English. Some of the people that come here were professionals back in their country, doctors and business people and lawyers, but because they don't speak English and they don't have the proper credentials, obviously they can't do that field, so they will work at whatever they have to with the hope of providing a better life for their kids, which probably our relatives or our ancestors came for that reason too. And I have this argument with my cousins every Christmas, but yes, the refugees pay taxes. Okay, why St. Louis? Because in the 1990s, when the United States committed to take a large number of Bosnian refugees into the United States, St. Louis was chosen as one of the main 3 or 4 resettlement cities because it was not what they called oversaturated with refugees. That's not my word, that's their word. Like New York and Chicago, we were seen as being able to absorb a large number. And also in those days, there were a lot of factory jobs available that didn't require much English. So we had a pretty good, it was a good experience. There were some problems, but for the most part, they were welcomed and they did well and assimilated well. And so St. Louis kind of got a reputation around the country of being as a refugee-friendly city. So then they started giving us people from Somalia and Afghanistan and Congo, and so now we're not one of the top 5 or 10, but we're up there. We're becoming more known as a refugee city. And in the case of these Bosnians, we're the largest Bosnian community in the world outside of Bosnia, about 80,000. But not all of them were resettled here originally. Probably a third of them were resettled elsewhere in the United States and then moved here because of a lower cost of living or because they had relatives here and because it was seen as a place where they would be welcomed. On the other hand, we got a lot of Southeast Asian refugees in the 80s, Cambodians and Laotians, and almost all of them moved to warmer climates because it was too cold for them here. So they're free to move once they get here. I said they don't have a choice of where they go, but once they get here, if they find out they have a cousin in Phoenix or a brother in Chicago, they're free to move there. If they, obviously if they can afford it or if they can find a way to do it. But that happens quite a bit. We call that secondary migration. Okay, now once they're here, they got to learn English. They got to get a job. I've talked about this. So a lot of times, since they can't work a professional job or they just don't have the English skills, they often have to take 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. And traditionally, a lot of these jobs were in factories which would hire, in the 90s, some of the employers were not a little bit hesitant to hire refugees because they thought there would be cultural problems or language problems. But they found that they have such a good work ethic that they asked for more once they got a few. So the good news is that there are jobs available. The bad news is they don't learn English at work because they're only speaking with other people from their country. So that's, I don't know, it's kind of a catch-22. I mentioned about the refugee Medicaid for 8 months, and it's really hard to find, a lot of times it's really hard to get insurance for people. They don't qualify for Medicaid once they've been here for 8 months. The jobs that offer insurance usually they hardly ever have good dental insurance, and a lot of people come with dental problems. It's really interesting, though, that a lot of times, I've seen this many times, people lived in refugee camps for years, but for some reason, maybe it's just the human survival instinct, but they didn't get physically sick when they were over there, but when they come here, they get sick all the time. I guess their body kind of relaxes a little, and they're constantly getting sick and getting colds and getting fevers. They may have come with wounds or amputations, but they didn't get sick. There's a lot of, I've mentioned that the trauma that they faced. Many people were tortured in concentration camps before they came here because of their religion or because of their ethnicity. The majority of people witnessed violence or lost close family members. Their homes were probably burned down. They really have no place to go back to. So they have all this stuff in their mind on top of the pressure to pay the rent and get a job. A lot of sexual violence too. This is a quote from a clinical psychologist in Germany, just basically saying, we can't expect people to learn a language and get a job in a month if they are reeling from the memories of what they went through. Mental health is a big issue. That's one of the things that my agency does. We provide therapy and psychiatry to people that are dealing with PTSD, but there's a big taboo against these. The people that we are getting the refugees are coming from countries that are very traditional, conservative countries. You don't talk about things like this. You don't talk about mental health problems. You just keep it in the family. So we had a hard time getting people to agree to try therapy. They described it as kind of a heaviness sometimes, or they described the mental anguish, the PTSD, in physical terms. These are some of the symptoms we see, some of the problems that people describe having. A lot of times they hear voices. When they sleep, they don't want to sleep because sleep brings nightmares. This is a chart from a German website, but I think it kind of mirrors what happens here, and it breaks down the percentages of refugees that have experienced certain things. And the first one is how many people witnessed violence, and this looks like 75% of adults and about 40% of children witnessed violence. The next one is saw dead bodies. The third one is victims of violence, and that's over half of adults. Torture is over half. Rape is 20% of adult women. So, we have 80,000 Bosnians in St. Louis. You can break that down and imagine how many people survive some of these things. And that's just Bosnians. And then triggers when they are here. These are some of the things that can trigger memories. And 4th of July is a really hard day for refugees because of all the fireworks, sirens. They're in these high crime neighborhoods where they hear sirens every day. They, sometimes the sight of a uniform can set people up. I have a little story, if you'll bear with me, but I think it's a good example of how uniforms can be a trigger. I mentioned people from Kosovo. In 1999, I met quite a few people from Kosovo, and I met one family, a couple with a son who was about 4 at the time, and they had to change their names to. It's a long story. It's not the point of the story, but they had to change their name in order to flee the country, and they wanted to legally change their name back to their original name here when they got here. So we went down to the courthouse. I took them to the courthouse. We were going to talk to the judge and, change the name. We were sitting in the courtroom downtown with the the big courtrooms with the big doors that open like this. And the little 4-year-old boy was getting kind of fussy, and so there was going to be a long time we would have to wait in that courtroom, so I offered to take him out into the hall to just, let him make noise out there and not disturb people. So we went out, and he was playing around, and he was on the outside in the hall. He was kind of peeking, the doors open like this, and he was peeking in the crack between the doors and kind of giggling. And on the other side of the door, there was an armed guard, uniformed guard. And he could hear this noise, and he opened the door to see what it was. He was a tall man, and this little boy, when he looked up and saw this man with a uniform and a gun, he got hysterical. It took us 30 minutes to calm him down. So I can't even imagine what memories, that brought back to him. Just the sight of a uniform. So I think we keep things like that in mind when we work with people. Sudden noises can bring back memories, large crowds, because a lot of times people will be rounded up in the town square or in the village, and then the men will be sent to one side for execution or whatever, and the women will be sent over for rape. So these things that we wouldn't think twice about can be terrifying. Certain television shows, a smell can bring back a memory. Anniversaries. This July 11th, last week, was the anniversary of the worst massacre in the Bosnian conflict, July 11th in Srebrenica. That was kind of like September 11th for us. So that day was really hard for Bosnians. I mentioned this. There's really a strong thing for you. The family dynamics change drastically when they come here because, again, traditional societies where the man is in control. In this country, the women often have to work, as well as the husband, to bring in enough income to survive. So that puts that dynamic on end. Children learn English faster than the parents, and so they wield the power that parents don't like, and they use that to their advantage, as you can imagine. Kids learn English quickly. They get tough when they get enrolled in these city schools. They take on the attitudes they kind of have to survive, I guess. A lot of times parents feel really guilty that they weren't able to protect their children or give the children the things they wanted back home, so they work themselves to death to buy cool clothes for the kids, and then so doing, they're not home with the kids, and they don't know the danger that the kids are getting into in school and on the streets. This is what I hear a lot from Americans I know. None of these things are true. I don't know why they think people insist that refugees get free cars. I don't know where that came from. And then this is how refugees see us. This is how many times I'm told they see us. And some of these are kind of true, like we don't really talk to our neighbors that much. We don't walk, we drive everywhere. I think Africa is one country. Yeah, we don't cook, we eat fast food every day. I'll stop here and let Sister Paulette take over.
Many of those things that Ron was talking about, I had stories for. I'm just going to tell you a kind of a general areas. I have a story about housing with a Bhutanese family who got into very poor housing, and believe it or not, it was the owner was a former refugee, which always blows my mind. The whole issue about what they receive when they come. There's a family that I first met that were placed in a home, an apartment which was not very well furnished at all, and they didn't have anything to eat the whole weekend. They didn't know where to go. Another, I can't go into any of these details, but Vietnamese woman that I met right early, 1992, her daughter came to the parish. She was pregnant. The mother was pregnant. Didn't know where to go, what to do. She ended up being my boss eventually because she knew English, and she told me what to do, where to go, what to get. So we're very good friends to this day. But people don't know where to go, what to do. The push to get a job is terrible.
First of all, right now, there are not very many jobs available, even for American people that are struggling. So it's much more difficult. And culturally, we Americans have this myth that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. This is not true at all. And as especially sisters that live in community, we know that from our vast experience. We can't do it by ourselves. Some of the people that I met early on were waiting for their children that were not allowed to come. One of the Vietnamese couples that I met early on, the first day I met them, 2 of my daughters can't come. Can you help get them? It took 10 years. There's a woman right now from Liberia who calls me at least twice a week, waiting for her children who are still in Liberia or Sierra Leone. And she has saved every cent. She's a woman that's illiterate, doesn't know how to read or write, works for minimum wage, saves every penny so she can sponsor her children, but it's not enough. And she's 65 years old. And she can't, the rules are so strict here. I think you have to be able to prove that you can support an immigrant. Those people would come as immigrants, her children, not as refugees anymore. I think it's 10 years. You have to show that you have to support them for 10 years. Everything. Medical, education. Impossible. There's a woman that I know for many years who has been denied asylum 3 times. She has many medical problems. Took care of 3 of her nieces when the mother died, and she's still in limbo. And she's from West Africa. There's another story I could tell you about the story of Georgette DeJona, who actually came here and spoke with your sisters here. She's from Congo. She worked in Congo for many years, but she's originally from Burundi. And short story, she is 76 years old, has gone back to Burundi 3 times, is setting up an orphanage for the children there. She said, I don't know, 50% of the kids are under 15, a lot of abandoned street kids, no humanitarian aid at all. I didn't know all that was going on in Burundi. One of the things I learned when I meet somebody from another country, immediately that country is right here. And you hear it on the news, and it makes it much more real. As Ron told you, for refugees, the vetting process is extremely strict. And the whole refugee situation is such a political ballgame. It has always been so in our country. I don't know where your ancestors came from. Some of them probably were able to come in without too much problem. But if you were Irish, if you were Chinese, and I just saw a documentary on immigration. I don't know if you know that the Chinese people finally got the right to become a citizen of the United States in 1954. And they were here for years. Years. They built the West. So it's political. It's just political. And if I would really like to study the whole history of immigration in the United States for a country of immigrants, we can't accept everybody, but who do we accept and who do we reject? And I think that goes along with the heart of religious life. You know, all the changes we've gone through since the 60s, and our change of focus on justice and option for the poor. Our awareness has certainly become much greater and more sensitive. And as Ron said, I think our greatest challenge is our own families and all the myths that our families have.
We have corporate statements. I think the 2 of you have added so much to our understanding, and certainly the stories that you tell, the heart with which you tell it is a real important thing for us to see. Because as we get into this more and more, we will be sharing that same heart sense, because we will know how much we are contributing to whoever is out there in need, however we define our corporate statement. So thank you so much, Ron and Paulette.